The crystal award in my hands weighed about 4 pounds, and it had my son-in-law's name cut into the face of it. I was the one holding it. 300 people in black tie were on their feet applauding a man who had spent 19 months quietly draining the pension fund of 900 hospital laundry workers. And I had been introduced, 30 seconds earlier, as the surprise presenter. He was smiling up at me from the front row. He had no idea who I was. He'd find out in about 90 seconds. I want to stop right there, before I go back and tell you how we got to that ballroom, because there's a thing I need you to understand about that moment. I wasn't angry. Everybody assumes I was angry. I've had a year to sit with it, and the honest truth is that what I felt, standing under those lights with a lump of engraved crystal in my hands, was tired. Bone tired. The kind of tired that comes from finally putting down something heavy you've been carrying so long you forgot it was heavy. My name is Walter Ruszkowski. Everybody who's known me longer than a week calls me Walt. I'm 71 years old and I've lived in the same brick row house on Fate Avenue in Baltimore since 1978. 2 bedrooms. A white marble stoop out front that I scrub with a wire brush every Saturday morning, because that's what my mother did, and her mother before her, and I'm not about to be the one who stops. I could buy the entire block. I could buy the next 4 blocks and the marina at the end of them. I've never so much as looked at a listing. Let me tell you about that dinner. That's where this really starts. It was the second week of February, and the wind was coming off the harbor the way it does in Baltimore in February, straight through your coat, like the coat was a suggestion. I parked my truck 4 blocks away. It's a 1996 pickup with a bedliner full of rock salt and a passenger door that doesn't match the rest of it, and I parked it 4 blocks away so the valet boys wouldn't have to look at it. Not because I was ashamed, because those kids have enough going on without me making their night complicated. I walked the 4 blocks in the cold. I was wearing a gray wool coat I bought in 2004 and a pair of boots I've had resoled twice. I looked exactly like what they thought I was. The restaurant was one of those places down on Aliciana Street where the oysters have a birth certificate and the steaks cost more than my first car. My son-in-law's parents were flying in from Palm Beach to celebrate his big promotion, and he had invited me to the dinner. I want to be precise about the word invited. He called me on a Tuesday and he sighed twice before he got the sentence out, and when I said yes, there was a pause on the line that told me he'd been counting on me saying no. I said yes anyway. I needed to see what my daughter had married into. My daughter's name is Nora. She's 34. She's the reason I'm still standing, and she's the reason for every single thing in this story, including the parts I got wrong. She married a man named Preston Vale 3 years ago in a small ceremony at the Catholic Church on Eastern Avenue, and from the first handshake I could read that man the way you read a weather front coming up the Chesapeake. I saw how he checked the make of a watch before he checked a face. I saw how his warmth turned on and off like a shop light depending on who walked into the room. He treated me with a kind of patient, exhausted courtesy the way you'd treat a slow-moving obstacle in a hallway you have to use every day. He believed I was a retired laundry worker living on a union pension. He believed the row house was the summit of my entire life. I never corrected him, not once, and I need you to hold on to that. Because by the end of this story I'm going to tell you that it was the single worst decision I ever made as a father, and I'm not going to soften it. I pushed through the door into all that warmth and garlic and money smell, and the hostess did the thing they do. Her eyes went down to my boots and came back up, and her smile got about 4% tighter. I gave her Preston's name. She walked me back past the main room to a private door at the end of a hallway. It was already open a crack. Nobody stood up when I came in. I want to be fair here and say maybe that's just how their kind of people do it. But I've been in enough rooms in 71 years to know when a man is being told something without words. Gerald Vale sat at the middle of that table in a charcoal suit with a watch on his wrist the size of a doorknob. Elizabeth, she goes by Bitsy, and I'm not making that up, wore silk and a rope of pearls and a face that had been pulled into a permanent mild disappointment. Preston was on the far side, swirling wine. He didn't offer his hand. He tipped his glass toward the chair at the very end of the table, as far from the 3 of them as the furniture allowed. Nora wasn't there. He said she'd gone to fix her makeup. I sat down. The work started before the water was even poured. Bitsy leaned in with her rings clicking on the tablecloth and asked me, in the sweetest voice you ever heard, how my little house was holding up in the cold. She leaned on the word little the way you'd lean on a word if you were describing a shed. Then she went into a long thing about how impossible it is to heat the place in Palm Beach when the humidity turns. Gerald jumped in about a river cruise they'd taken through Portugal. 3 weeks. He described the boat twice. Then he looked straight at my boots and asked me what exactly I'd done for a living before I retired to my quiet little life. I told him the truth. I said I'd worked with my hands. I said I spent 40-some years around industrial laundry hospital linens, surgical drapes, sterile wrap, the loading docks, the tunnel washers, the whole thing. I said I'd spent more hours of my life inside a hot building that smelled like bleach than most men spend asleep. All of it true. I just left out the part where I own it. Gerald laughed, short and loud, and he cut a look at his wife, and the two of them had a whole conversation with their eyebrows, and I watched them file me. That's what it was filing. Uneducated. Laborer. Nothing here. Move along. Preston went red from the collar up and looked at his bread plate. Not because his parents were being cruel, because I was embarrassing him by existing in front of them. And listen, if you've ever sat at a table where somebody you're related to was ashamed of you, you already know the specific temperature of that. It isn't loud. Nobody hits anybody. It's just this cold little draft that comes off a person who wishes you'd stayed home. You feel it in the back of your neck. And the worst part is, you start managing them sitting a little straighter, talking a little less, making yourself smaller so they can be comfortable. I've watched grown men do it at their own children's weddings. I drank tap water and I said very little, and I let them run. Every remark Bitsy made about restaurants and private schools and who they knew was a little brick, and she was building a wall with them, and the wall said, "You are not one of us and you never will be." I didn't argue with the wall. You don't argue with a wall. You find out who's paying for the bricks. The food came. Towers of shellfish on ice. Gerald didn't touch his. Instead, he reached into his jacket and brought out a leather folio, oxblood, the kind with a little brass clasp. He set it on the table. He pressed 2 fingers on it and slid it across the cloth, past the bread, past the butter, until it came to rest against the edge of my plate. The room went quiet. Preston stared at his silverware like he was studying for an exam. Bitsy took a very small sip of wine and watched me over the rim of the glass with something I can only describe as appetite. I asked what it was. Gerald told me. He told me flat, like a man reading off a delivery manifest. Inside was a cashier's check for $35,000, and underneath it was a signed 12-month lease on a 1-bedroom unit at a senior community outside Ocala, Florida, fully executed. First and last already paid. All I had to do was invent a story about my health, something about my knees, something about wanting the warm weather. Pack up the rowhouse. Go. And stop being in my daughter's life. My heart went slow. That's what happens to me. Some men's hearts race. Mine drops into this heavy, deliberate rhythm, like a machine idling down before you throw a switch. I asked him why on earth I'd do that, and Gerald leaned in, and his voice got quiet in the way a man's voice gets when he's finally saying the true thing, and he told me that Preston had just been named chief executive of Cardinal Standard. He said his son was moving in circles now. He said there were board seats coming, foundation work, the governor's dinner in the spring. And then he looked at my coat and at my hands, and he told me that a man in Preston's position couldn't be photographed next to somebody who looked like he'd wandered in off a loading dock. He used the phrase, social liability. He said it like it was a category on a tax form. I didn't touch the folio. I turned my head and I looked at Preston, the boy I let marry my only child. The man who had stood in front of a priest and 120 people and made promises about family. I asked him directly. I said, "Do you agree with your father?" I asked him if he genuinely wanted me to take that money and disappear out of Nora's life. He lifted his head. He looked me right in the eye. I'll give him that much. He looked right at me and he said yes. He said, running a company the size of Cardinal Standard requires a certain image. He said, and I'm giving you his exact words because they've lived in my head ever since. You can't be the father-in-law who smells like a boiler room. He told me to take the money and do what was best for everybody. Nobody said anything. Now I promised myself when I started telling this story that I wouldn't turn Preston Vale into a cartoon, because that would be a lie, and it would also make this whole thing less interesting than it actually is. So let me give you the piece I didn't have that night. The piece I got months later out of a federal deposition. When Preston was 12, 2 men came to his house in Wilmington and took the piano. Repossession. His mother stood on the front lawn in her good coat, telling the neighbors it was being taken away to be tuned. She said it 3 separate times, to 3 separate people, in the same bright voice, and then she went inside and sat in the empty spot where the piano had been. Gerald Vale spent his entire adult life being almost rich. Always one deal out, always a partner who let him down, a market that turned, a man who didn't keep his word. And that family stayed afloat on appearances and other people's money, and a truly heroic amount of denial. So Preston didn't learn that money matters. Plenty of us learn that. Preston learned that the appearance of money is the only thing standing between your family and the men who come for the piano. Understand him. I'm asking you to understand him, not to excuse him, because understanding him is the only way the rest of this lands right. The door opened and Nora came back in, bright, completely unaware, asking if we'd ordered yet. And I reached out and slid that oxblood folio into my inside coat pocket. I want you to see what happened in that room. Gerald and Bitsy traded a look fast, victorious, gone in half a second. And Preston let out this little breath he'd been holding. They thought I'd taken it. They thought the poor old man had folded. I looked at my daughter, my Nora, who's kind in a way that costs her, who apologizes when other people bump into her, who deserved so much better than the 3 people sitting at that table. I didn't shout. I've never once in my life gotten what I wanted by shouting. Anger is what you reach for when you don't have anything else. And I had everything. I stood up slow. I reached into my trouser pocket and pulled out a small brass token, about the size of a quarter, worn smooth on both faces. It's a laundry token from my first plant on Haven Street. We used them in the driver break room for the coffee machine in 1982 because the machine wouldn't take the new coins. I've carried one in my pocket for 40 years the way some men carry a lucky stone. I set it down in the middle of my empty plate. I looked at Preston and I told him that ought to cover the water. He had no idea what he was looking at. None of them did. Bitsy actually leaned over to see it. Then I turned to my daughter and I put a smile on my face that cost me more than anything else that night. I told her the cold had given me a headache and I needed to get home and lie down. She got up right away and said she'd drive me. She always does that. She's always the first one up. I kissed her forehead and told her to stay. Enjoy the evening with her new family. Those words were ash in my mouth and I said them anyway. On my way out, I got one last look at Gerald. He was already cutting into his steak, and he had the exact expression of a man who believes he has just bought something at a discount. I pushed out through the doors into that February wind, and the old man went away. I don't know how else to describe it to you. The shuffle went out of my walk. My spine came up. 2 hours of playing small, and it came off me on that sidewalk like a coat. I stood there in the cold with the harbor smell coming up the street, and I took my phone out of my pocket and called a number I hadn't used in 11 months. Odette Kwan picked up on the first ring. She's been my corporate counsel for 31 years. She's 5'1", and I have personally watched her make a room full of merger attorneys apologize for existing. I didn't say hello. I said, "They took it." Then I told her my son-in-law had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross, and I wanted a full forensic audit of every executive account Preston Vale had touched since the board handed him the chair. She said, "How deep?" I said, "All the way to the floor. I want to tell you about the company now, because you can't understand what came after unless you know what it cost to build. 1981. My wife, Danuta, everybody called her Danny, died on a Thursday in October. An aneurysm. No warning, no illness. Nothing to prepare for. She was 31. She managed a school cafeteria on Conkling Street, and she could make 400 kids eat vegetables through sheer force of personality. I was left with a 4-year-old daughter, $11,000 of hospital debt, and a hole in my chest I still haven't found the bottom of. I took what I had left, and I bought a used panel van and a contract nobody wanted, picking up soiled linen from 2 nursing homes in Dundalk and running it out to a wash house in Essex. It's ugly work. Nobody wants to talk about it at parties. But every hospital bed in America needs clean sheets on it every single day, and somebody has to do that, and I figured that somebody might as well be me. I ran routes 20 hours a day. Nora slept in a laundry basket wedged into the passenger footwell with a folded moving blanket in it, because childcare was $14 a day, and I did not have $14 a day. I have a photograph of that basket. It's the only picture from that whole year. I skipped meals so she wouldn't. I'm not saying that for sympathy. I'm saying it because Preston Vale sat across a table and offered me $35,000 to walk away from that girl, and I want you to hold those two facts next to each other. One van turned into six. Six into a wash house of my own on Haven Street. Then a second plant. Then the sterile wrap division. Then the contracts with the university hospital system. Then Pennsylvania. Then Virginia and the Carolinas. By 2009, Cardinal Standard was doing linen, sterile processing, and biohazard handling for 140 hospitals, and I had 900 and some employees, and every one of them had a pension. A real one. Not a match. Not a maybe. A defined benefit pension, which by then made me either a genius or a lunatic depending on which consultant you asked. I set it up in '88, the first year we cleared real money, because I remembered exactly what it felt like to be 32 years old with a dead wife and a child and nothing behind me. 12 years ago, my heart started giving me trouble, and I made a decision. I put my controlling shares into a blind trust, took my name off the public registry, appointed Odette as the trustee of record, and walked away. The board ran the company. The founder became a rumor, and I went home to Fate Avenue and scrubbed my marble step on Saturdays. 2 years back, that board hired a rising star named Preston Vale. Sharp resume, great in a room. They had no idea he'd just married the founder's daughter, because they had no idea the founder had a daughter, because officially the founder didn't exist. And Preston walked into that corner office believing he'd taken it with his own two hands. He looked at my boots and my rowhouse, and he filed me, same as his father did. He never once considered that the building he parked under, the salary that paid for his suits, and the title he used to make waiters nervous all belonged to the quiet old man he was trying to erase. 48 hours. That's how long the audit took to find the first hole. Odette turned a conference room on the 51st floor into a war room and brought in an outside forensic team, nobody internal, nobody who'd ever cashed a Cardinal Standard check. The lead was a heavyset, soft-spoken man named Marcus Bell, who ate sunflower seeds constantly and did not blink for what felt like minutes at a time. I sat at the end of that table for 2 straight days drinking bad coffee and watching my life's work get taken apart on a wall monitor. Late on the second night, Marcus stopped clicking. He turned the monitor toward me and said, "This isn't sloppiness. This is architecture." Preston had built a set of vendors that didn't exist. Linen reclamation services. Biohazard transport subcontractors. Names that sounded like every other name in our industry, the kind of vendor a board member's eyes slide right past on a quarterly report. He was signing off on invoices for pickups that never happened, from trucks that never existed, on routes that were never run. Millions. Out of the treasury, into accounts he controlled, and then out again into a web of consulting fees and family trusts. And then Marcus found the other thing, and this is the one that made my hands go cold on the table. He'd been taking from the pension. Not draining it, he wasn't stupid. A drained fund gets flagged. He'd been quietly redirecting the employer contributions. On paper, the fund looked healthy. In reality, it was 19 months behind and hollowing out from the inside, and nobody was going to notice until the first big wave of retirements hit in about 4 years. 900 people, men and women who'd stood on a hot concrete floor pulling wet linen out of a tunnel washer for 25 years. Rosalie in accounts payable, who's been with me since the Essex days. Big Tom on the loading dock, whose son just started at Towson. I sat there and I thought about '88, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad, doing the math on that pension by hand, deciding I could carry it. He was stealing that. Then Marcus opened the last file, and the room got very quiet, and I understood the whole shape of it. The money wasn't going to the Caymans to wait for him. It was coming back into the country through consulting retainers and trusts, and the primary beneficiaries of those trusts were Gerald and Bitsy Vale. The river cruised through Portugal. The watch the size of a doorknob. Bitsy's jewelry. 2 leased vehicles registered in Gerald's name. And 11 weeks before that dinner, a wire of $4.2 million out of a Cardinal Standard capital reserve into a holding company in Bitsy's name used to buy an equestrian estate up in Moncton, with a 12-stall barn and a show-jumping operation attached to it. I sat in that chair and I did the arithmetic. They had looked me in the face and offered me $35,000 to leave my daughter's life. And that $35,000 had come out of the same treasury I built with my own hands, out of the same building where I once slept in a van with a 4-year-old in a laundry basket. They tried to buy my absence, with my own money. I've been angry maybe 4 times in my life in a way that mattered. That was one. And I sat there, and I let it come all the way up, and then I let it cool, because anger makes a man sloppy, and I could not afford to be sloppy. I let it set into something harder and quieter, and a great deal more useful. Marcus asked if we should call the authorities that night. He said we could have Preston in cuffs at his desk before 9 the next morning. I said no, not because I wanted a spectacle. I want to be honest with you about this, because I've thought about it a lot and I don't come out looking clean. Part of me wanted the spectacle. Part of me was a 71-year-old man who'd been called a boiler room by a boy in a $4,000 suit, and that part of me wanted a room full of people to watch. But the bigger part was strategy. A quiet arrest lets Gerald and Bitsy stand up in front of a camera and say they had no idea. Their son fell in with bad influences. They're victims, too. A quiet arrest lets the assets vanish into a bankruptcy, while the lawyers argue. I wanted the net to close on all 3 of them at once. So I told Odette to build it slow and let them keep climbing. 3 days later, a black sedan pulled up outside my row house. I was on the front step with a bucket of water and a wire brush. Saturday morning. I heard the door and then those shoes coming up the sidewalk, and I didn't have to look. Preston stood over me in a silver suit and told me we should go inside because the neighborhood was affecting his mood. I stood up, dried my hands on a rag, and led him into the house where I raised his wife. He came in without wiping his feet, deliberately. I watched him do it. His eyes went over Danny's chair, the mantel, the marks on the kitchen door frame where I measured Nora every August until she was 17. He dropped a briefcase on my coffee table and snapped it open and threw a stack of paper down in front of me. He told me to sit down and read. I stayed standing. It was a non-disclosure agreement bolted to a renunciation of claims. I was to legally swear I'd never speak about the money his parents offered me, and I was to formally renounce any future financial claim on Nora or her household. He wanted me to sign my way into permanent silence and permanent poverty. I asked him mildly, "What happens if I don't?" And he stepped in close, into my space, in my own front room, and dropped his voice to a whisper. He told me he controlled their money, their house, and their calendar. He told me he'd make sure I never saw Nora again. He told me I would never meet a grandchild. He talked about my daughter like she was an asset on a schedule. There was a younger version of me, the one who unloaded trucks for 20 hours a day, the one who once threw a supplier's rep out of a plant office by his belt, who would have put that boy through my own drywall. I want to be honest. I felt him wake up. I felt him stand up in my chest. But I've had 50 years to learn what patience is worth, and I have never once regretted the thing I didn't say. So I went into the kitchen. I washed the grit off my hands and dried them on the towel that hangs on the oven door. I came back, picked up a plastic pen from the mail basket, leaned over my own coffee table, and signed my name at the bottom of his document. I signed it slow, and I smiled while I did it. He snatched the papers before the ink was dry, shoved them in his case, puffed up like a man who'd just closed something. He just handed me a signed, dated, witness document proving he had attempted to extort the majority shareholder of his own company. He documented his own blackmail, and then he carried it out my front door in a briefcase. At the door, he turned around for one more. He told me Cardinal Standard's foundation dinner was in 10 days at the Rowan Hotel, and that he was receiving the Steward of the Year award, the industry's ethics award, the one they give for stewardship of the workforce. I want you to sit with that for a second. The man who was hollowing out 900 pensions was getting an ethics award. He told me I was not to come anywhere near the building. He said my presence would be an embarrassment to the guests. He said hotel security would put me on the sidewalk if I tried. I told him I understood his position completely, and I wished him a wonderful evening. He sneered and left. I watched his car go down Fade Avenue. Then I picked up my bucket and finished my step, because it was Saturday. The Wednesday after that, I got humiliated in public for the second time, and this one, I minded more. I volunteer Wednesday mornings at the parish food pantry in Highlandtown, have for 9 years. I break down pallets and stack the shelves and haul the donation boxes in from the alley, because I'm 71 and I can still lift 80 pounds, And there's a woman named Dot Pyle who runs that pantry and would work herself into the ground if nobody helped her. I was in the back in a flannel shirt with my sleeves rolled, wrestling a pallet of canned corn, and I heard Bitsy Vale's voice come through the front door. They'd come to make a donation. Photographs, a small check, a hand-delivered box of things from Palm Beach that had never been near a hungry person. Gerald had a coat over his shoulders like a cape. Bitsy was in a silk trench, holding a handbag worth more than Dot Pyle makes in half a year. Gerald spotted me, and his face lit up like Christmas. He came over loud. He wanted an audience, and he had 1 Dot at the counter, 2 volunteers, 4 people in line for groceries. He laughed and said it was fitting, seeing me here hauling boxes, and that this was the correct destination for a man like me now that his brilliant son was running the show. Bitsy stepped up beside him. Her perfume went through that room like a chemical spill. She announced loudly, so the people in the grocery line could hear that it was a blessing I was finally accepting my proper place. She said Preston was about to redefine the whole company and scrub out every trace of the old blue-collar way of doing things. She told the room about the awards dinner, the champagne, who was coming. Then she looked at my hands, and she said people like me belong exactly where I was standing. I didn't answer. Not one word. I stood there and I let her talk. But here's what I want to tell you, and it's the only part of that morning that actually hurt. I looked past her at the grocery line. There was a young mother with a toddler on her hip, and a man in a Carhartt with his hat in his hands, and they were looking at the floor. Because Bitsy Vale had just stood in a food pantry and announced, at volume, that this was where the worthless people go. She wasn't just insulting me. She was insulting every person in that line, and every one of them heard it, and every one of them just took it, because that's what you do when you need the groceries. If you have ever been in a line you were ashamed to be standing in a benefits office, a clinic, a food bank, a pawn shop, you know that specific silence. You keep your eyes down and you wait for it to be over, and you tell yourself it's temporary. I've been in that line. 1982, St. Casimir's, with Nora on my hip. That's the morning I stopped feeling anything at all about what was coming for those 2 people. I turned around and I thanked Dot, and I told her the corn was stacked, and I put $300 bills in the box on her counter, and I walked out past the Vales without looking at either one of them. I loaded my truck and I sat in the cab for a minute with my hands on the wheel. 9 days. Then it rained. Thursday night. Hard. The kind of Baltimore rain that comes sideways off the water. I was at my kitchen table with the audit spread out in front of me when somebody started hammering on my front door. It wasn't Preston's knock. Preston knocks like he's annoyed the door exists. This was fast and panicked. Nora was on my step, soaked through, hair stuck to her face, no umbrella, shaking so hard she couldn't get a word out. She just fell into my chest and made a sound I had not heard out of my daughter since her mother's funeral. I got her inside and locked the door and put a wool blanket around her and made tea. And I sat down across from her, and I didn't ask a single question because I already knew whose name was at the bottom of this. It came out in pieces. She'd gone to the grocery store on Boston Street that afternoon. Her card came back declined. She tried a second one, then a third. Every account with her name attached had been frozen. She stood at that register with a cart full of food and a line behind her and had to walk out. She called Preston thinking there'd been a bank error. He didn't ask if she was all right. He detonated. He called her financially reckless. He told her she was a liability to his image, and he'd frozen the accounts to teach her some discipline. My hands went into fists under that table, and I made them open up again, because that's the second phase. First you isolate the money, then you isolate the person. Then she told me the real reason she'd run out into the storm. He'd come home an hour later with a folder and put it on the kitchen island and told her to sign. It was a transfer of title. He wanted the Fate Avenue rowhouse well, not this one, the other one. The one on Foster Avenue that Danny inherited from her parents in '79 and put in a trust for Nora before she died. 3 bedrooms, needs a roof, rented to the same family for 11 years. It's not worth much. That's the point. Danny set it aside as a floor. Something our girl could always stand on if the whole world went sideways. Preston told her he needed it as collateral on a bridge loan for a property they were buying. He said it was a formality. When she hesitated when she asked, please, to read it. First he called her an ungrateful drag on his life. He said she didn't trust him. He said if it wasn't signed by morning, the marriage was over. And I sat in my kitchen and watched the whole design snap into focus. He wasn't buying property, he was packing. The foundation dinner was going to be followed by the closing of a regional acquisition, a big influx of capital moving through accounts in a 2-week window. He was going to use that chaos to take the last of what he could carry. And then he was going to go. But his greed was so complete, so absolutely without a floor, that he couldn't leave even the roof-needs-fixing rowhouse behind. He was going to strip my daughter of her dead mother's last gift, and then he was going to file from somewhere without an extradition treaty and leave her with nothing and a lawyer's bill. He was going to throw her away like a receipt. I sat there and looked at my child crying at the same table where I did the pension math in '88. And I'll tell you what I wanted to do. I wanted to tell her everything. Right then, I wanted to say, "Sweetheart, I own the building he parks under." I wanted to say, "You are the heir to something you can't imagine, and that man is already a dead letter." I didn't say it. 2 reasons, and only one of them was good. The good one. If I told her that night, everything about her would change: her posture, her voice, the way she typed a text and Preston reads people for a living. He'd have known within a day. The bad one. The one I've had to live with. I had built my whole identity on being the man who protected her by keeping the secret, and I wasn't ready to admit that the secret was the thing that let a predator walk right through my front door. So I took her hands and I told her she was not going back to that house. She'd sleep in her old room. She would not answer his calls. She would not sign anything. She looked up at me and asked in a small voice what we were going to do. I told her that by Saturday night, that man would never be able to hurt her again, and she believed me. That's the part that undoes me. She didn't ask how a retired laundry worker was going to beat a chief executive. She just leaned back in the chair and let out this long, shaking breath and said, "Okay, Daddy." She's 34 years old and she said, "Okay, Daddy." I put her to bed in her childhood room. I stood in the hall until her breathing went even. Then I went back to the kitchen and called Odette and told her to move everything up. Here's what the last 9 days looked like. Odette executed my emergency shareholder authority and froze the company's financial arteries, every executive account, every outbound wire, the whole treasury, locked. Preston's card stopped working on a Tuesday, and he assumed it was a bank issue and was too proud to make it a whole thing. She filed for a mandatory shareholder disclosure and scheduled it, legally, inside the awards dinner. Preston was required to be present. He was going to host the event that took him apart, and she took the audit to the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Bureau's financial crimes people. 19 months of forged invoices, phantom subcontractors, routing numbers, and the piece that made a federal prosecutor's voice change on the phone: the diverted pension contributions. That's not just fraud. That's a specific federal statute with a specific and very unpleasant sentencing range. They agreed to stage out of the service corridor and the loading dock. They would move when I gave the word and not 1 second before. The night before, I went into my bedroom closet and took out a garment bag I hadn't opened in a long time. Now, if this were a movie, this is where I'd tell you about some magnificent hand-tailored suit I'd been saving. I didn't have one. I've never owned one. What was in that bag was a plain gray 2-button suit I bought at a men's store on Eastern Avenue in 1976. I got married in it. I buried Danny in it. I walked Nora down the aisle in it 3 years ago, and Bitsy Vale asked me, in front of people, whether it was vintage. I pressed it on the ironing board in my bedroom with the steam hissing, and I took my time. There's something about ironing. It's a slow thing you can't rush, and it gave my hands something to do while my head went where it needed to go. And then I did the one thing I'd been thinking about all week. I went to the kitchen drawer and got my old plant ID badge from the Haven Street facility. Photograph from 1991. Employee number 4. My name in block letters. I clipped it to the lapel, because I wasn't going into that ballroom to become somebody. I was going in to stop pretending I wasn't. The Rowan Hotel ballroom is all glass and gilt with a chandelier the size of a car. 300 people. Hospital administrators, foundation board, half the city's healthcare money, a state senator, and the entire Cardinal Standard executive team in black tie. I came in the side, at 7:40, and stood in the shadow of a pillar at the back, and I watched. Preston was in the middle of the floor with a glass in his hand like a scepter, laughing with 2 of my vice presidents, beautiful tuxedo. He looked like the photograph they were going to run. He had no idea his authority had been stripped 30 hours earlier. He was a ghost at his own party, and he was working the room. Gerald and Bitsy were doing their circuit. Gerald had his hand on the shoulder of a hospital system president, telling him something with both eyebrows up. Bitsy was introducing herself to the wives, wearing a bracelet I could have told you the wire transfer number for, and I stood back there in a 50-year-old gray suit with a laminated badge on my chest, and I felt this is going to sound strange. I felt sorry for them. Just for a second. Just for about the length of a breath. Because I was looking at two people who had spent their entire lives terrified that somebody would find out they weren't real. And now 300 people were about to find out at once, under a chandelier, with a photographer present. Then I thought about a young mother looking at the floor of a food pantry, and it passed. At 8:15 they moved to the program. The foundation director got up, thanked the sponsors, made the joke about the parking, and then she announced that the Steward of the Year award would be presented by a special guest, and that the presenter had asked to remain unnamed until the moment. I watched Preston's face from the back of the room. He liked that. He assumed it was somebody important. He straightened his jacket and turned toward the stage with his chin up, and Odette Kwan walked out to the podium. There were maybe 40 people in that room who knew who she was, and every one of them stopped moving at the same time. I watched my chief financial officer put his glass down on a table without looking at the table. I watched our general counsel take a step backward into a chair. Because if the trustee of the founder's blind trust is standing at a microphone, then something has happened. Odette adjusted the mic. She didn't smile. She said that under the corporate charter, the majority shareholder had invoked a mandatory disclosure, and that the meeting was now in session, and that all directors present were required to remain. The room made a sound, not a gasp, lower than that, a kind of shifting. Then she said that for the first time in 12 years, the founder of Cardinal Standard had chosen to be present. And Preston Vale, I want to describe this precisely, because I was watching him the whole time. Preston Vale smiled. He smiled, and he squared his shoulders, and he started scanning the room for an older, wealthy man in a good tuxedo, because he had decided, instantly, that this was a surprise blessing. The mystery founder was coming out of the shadows to bless the merger and shake his hand in front of the entire city. He was already writing the press release in his head. I've thought about that smile more than almost anything else in this story. Odette raised her hand and pointed to the back of the room. 300 heads turned. And there I was. Gray suit, badge. Nobody clapped. Nobody moved. Somebody's fork hit a plate. I started walking. It's about 90 feet from that pillar to the stage, and I have never in my life taken a longer walk. My knees were bad that night. They're bad most nights, and I could feel every step of it, and I did not hurry for anybody. The crowd opened up. I went past a table of hospital administrators I've done business with for 20 years, and I watched two of them recognize me and then look at each other like they'd seen a car accident. I went past our head of operations, who's been with me since Essex, and he stood up. Just stood up. He didn't say anything. He just got out of his chair as I went by, and I have never forgotten that. I went past Gerald and Bitsy. Bitsy had her hand on the ice sculpture table, and she was holding a champagne flute at a 45-degree angle and pouring it slowly onto the tablecloth without any awareness that she was doing it. Gerald had gone a color I've only ever seen on men having a cardiac event. His mouth was open, not talking, just open. And then I was past them, and up the 3 steps, and standing next to Odette. Preston was in the front row, less than 15 feet. He had not moved. The smile was still on his face, but it wasn't a smile anymore. It was a thing left over on his face after the person behind it had gone somewhere else. He was looking at my badge. I could see his eyes on it, trying to make it fit. I stepped to the microphone, and I looked at 300 people, and I want to tell you what I was thinking because it wasn't triumph. I was thinking about a laundry basket in the footwell of a van. I've never been much for speeches, so I kept it plain. I told the room good evening, and that my name is Walter Ruszkowski, and that in 1981 I bought a used van and a linen route out of 2 nursing homes in Dundalk. I told them I own 81% of Cardinal Standard Services, and I have since the day there was a Cardinal Standard Services to own. And then I picked up the Crystal Award off the podium, the Steward of the Year Award, 4 pounds of engraved glass with Preston Vale's name cut into the face of it, and I held it up so the light caught it. I said this award is given for stewardship of a workforce. I said, I'd like to walk you through how this year's recipient has been stewarding ours. And I set the award down on the podium and opened the folder. The screens behind me had been showing the foundation logo. They went black. Then they came up white and blue, with a wire transfer log blown up 8 feet tall. I walked them through it. Slow. I'm not a dramatic man, and I didn't need to be, because the numbers were dramatic all by themselves. The phantom subcontractors. The pickup routes billed for trucks that don't exist. The invoices signed with a signature that a document examiner had already testified was forged from a scan of our vice president of operations, who was sitting at table 9 and had to be handed a glass of water. Then the pension. I put the contribution schedule on the screen, the one that shows what was supposed to go in, next to what actually went in, for 19 months. And I said a number out loud, 906. That's how many people work for Cardinal Standard. I said I could give them a rough count of how many of those are within 5 years of retirement, because I had asked that morning, and it's 141. Then I said the part I'd been holding. I said that I set that pension up at a kitchen table in 1988, on a legal pad, because I had been a 32-year-old man with a dead wife, and a 4-year-old and nothing behind me, and I had decided that nobody who worked for me was ever going to be in that position without a floor under them. The room was so quiet I could hear the ice machine behind the bar. And then I did the last part. I put up the deed to the equestrian estate in Moncton and the $4.2 million wire that bought it, side by side, dates matching, and I turned, and I looked out at where Gerald and Bitsy Vale were standing in the middle of the floor. I said that the lifestyle you have all been admiring at this table for 2 years is not the product of business acumen. I said it's a costume, and every thread of it was paid for out of the account that was supposed to hold the retirements of the people who wash your hospital's surgical linens. And the crowd did something I'll remember for the rest of my life. They stepped back. Nobody said a word to them. Nobody shouted. 300 people in evening clothes simply and quietly opened up a circle about 12 feet across, with Gerald and Bitsy alone in the middle of it, and then stood there and looked at them. That's high society. That's the whole thing right there. They'll take you in for the price of a good story, and the second the story turns, they'll put 12 feet of parquet floor between you and them without spilling a drink. Bitsy reached out toward a woman she'd been talking to for 20 minutes. The woman looked at her hand, then looked away, and that's when Preston came up the steps. He came fast and he came badly, tripping on the second one, and he got to the podium and grabbed for the microphone with both hands, and I did not move an inch. He was crying, not softly. His face was wrecked and shining, and he was shouting into a live mic that the documents were fabricated, that this was a coup, that his father-in-law was a bitter old man, that the board should not listen. And then he stopped shouting and started begging. That was worse. He said he could put it back. He said he had a plan to put it back before anybody was hurt, that the acquisition would have covered the gap in the fund, that nobody was ever going to lose a dime, that he just needed 12 more months. And here's the thing. I believed him. I want you to understand that, because it's the strangest part of the whole night. Standing up there, looking at him, I believed that Preston Vale genuinely thought he was going to put it back. That's what men like that always think. They're not planning to steal your retirement, they're borrowing it, in their own heads, against a future where everything works out, and nobody ever finds out, and the piano stays in the living room. He was a terrified 12-year-old in a tuxedo, and he had put 141 people's old age into a hole to keep his mother from ever having to explain the piano again. Odette moved to step between us, and I put my hand up and stopped her. I let him finish. Then I leaned into the microphone and I said the only unkind thing I said all night, and I said it quietly. I told him that intending to give it back is not a defense, it's a description of the feeling you have while you're taking it. I told him that a man who requires 900 people to be poorer so that he can look rich is not a chief executive, he's a costume with a title on it. And I told him that effective immediately he was terminated, and that he would never again set foot in a building with my name in the deed. He went down on his knees on that stage. Right there, in front of the state senator and the foundation board and the photographer. Nobody clapped. I want to be clear about that, because I've heard people tell this story back to me with applause in it. There was no applause. 300 people watched a man's life end, and they did it in total silence, and it was one of the most terrible things I've ever been present for. I looked toward the back of the room, and I raised my right hand. The service doors opened. They came in quiet, which surprised me. No shouting, no boots. Federal agents in dark jackets moving through a black tie crowd like water going around rocks. Two of them came up the stage steps and got Preston under the arms and stood him up, and he didn't fight. He was past fighting. The cuffs made a small sound that the microphone picked up. Gerald ran, 72 years old, in loafers, and he ran for the kitchen doors, and he made it about 11 feet before a woman in a windbreaker with a badge on a chain stepped out from behind a serving station and stopped him with a hand on his chest. He didn't even try to get past her. He just started explaining. Loudly. To everybody. He was explaining as they walked him out. Bitsy stayed absolutely still. An agent came to her with a folder and told her, in a completely level voice, that the Moncton property and its contents were under a federal seizure order effective that afternoon, along with the vehicles and the accounts. She asked her to remove the bracelet. And Bitsy Vale looked around that ballroom, at 300 people she'd spent 2 years trying to be, and asked if anybody would call her a lawyer. Nobody moved. She unclasped it herself. Her hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries, and every second of it happened in complete silence, and the agent waited, and the room watched. They walked all 3 of them out through the main doors. I stood at that podium until the doors shut. Then I found my daughter. Nora had come with Odette, and had been standing behind the last pillar on the left the whole time. She'd seen all of it. Her whole understanding of her own life had been rebuilt in front of her in about 11 minutes. She was gripping the edge of a cocktail table with both hands. I came down off that stage and crossed the floor, and I didn't say anything. I just opened my arms. She hit my chest like she was 5 years old, and it knocked me back half a step. She held onto the lapels of a 50-year-old gray suit, and she cried into it. And I stood there in the wreckage of the most expensive evening in that hotel's calendar and held my kid. When she could talk, she said, "He never loved me." And I said, "No, he didn't." I didn't soften it. I've thought about that a lot too. She didn't need a cushion. She'd have felt the lie. She needed one true sentence from somebody who wasn't going to manage her. Then she asked me why. 12 years. Why didn't you tell me? And this is where I have to tell you the part I don't like. I gave her the good answer first. I told her that money makes you visible to the wrong kind of person. I told her that when her mother died, I made a promise that she'd grow up knowing what work costs and what people are worth, and that she'd never have to wonder whether somebody loved her or loved the balance sheet behind her. All of that is true. And then I told her the rest. I told her that somewhere in those 12 years, protecting her had turned into something else. It had turned into a thing I was, the quiet man with the secret. And I'd gotten so comfortable being that man that I'd never once asked whether the secret still had a job to do. I told her the truth is that if she had known, at 29, exactly what her family was and exactly what her name was attached to, Preston Vale would never have gotten within 100 miles of her. He didn't target a wealthy woman. He couldn't have. She didn't look wealthy. He targeted a woman with no floor under her, because that's who you can control. My secret didn't protect my daughter. It disarmed her. I stood in that ballroom and apologized to my child for the single greatest mistake of my life, and she put her hand on the side of my face and told me to stop. I haven't stopped. I don't think I will. 6 months went by the way 6 months do. Preston took a plea. His lawyers looked at what Marcus Bell had built and told him to take it because there was nothing to argue with. Wire fraud and a separate count for the retirement fund, which is the one that carried the weight. 8 years. Federal and full restitution he will never in his life be able to pay. The pension got made whole. That was the first check I wrote, before the trial, before anything out of my own accounts, into that fund, plus the growth it should have earned. Nobody at Cardinal Standard lost $1. A lot of them never knew how close it came. The Moncton estate sold at auction. The horses went to a farm in Kentucky, and I'm told they're fine, which mattered to me more than it probably should have. Gerald and Bitsy weren't charged in the end. The prosecutors decided the evidence of knowledge was thin, and honestly, I think they were right. I don't think Gerald ever asked where it came from. I think not asking was the entire skill of his life. But every asset went, because the assets were traceable, and civil forfeiture doesn't much care what you knew. They live in a 2-bedroom rental in a town in Central Florida I'd never heard of. Bitsy's sister sends money. Nobody from Palm Beach calls. Gerald, 72 years old with no verifiable skills and a name that turns up in a search, applied for 11 jobs, and got one 3 days a week in the parts department of a boat dealership, and I'm told he's good at it, which is the most human fact in this entire story. I don't gloat about them. I did for about a month. Then it got boring, and then it got a little shameful, and then it just went away. Nora lives in the Foster Avenue row house now, the one her mother left her. She fixed the roof herself, hired the crew, ran the whole job, argued a contractor down $1,100, and called me afterwards so proud I could hear her grinning through the phone. She works 4 days a week at a workforce program on Eastern Avenue, helping people who've been out of the market for years get back into it. She's very good at it. She doesn't need the job. She goes anyway. She knows exactly what she has now. Every account, every share, the whole structure, in writing, in a binder, in her kitchen. Which brings me to what this whole thing taught me, and I'll say it plain because I think it's the only thing in this story actually worth anybody's time. I spent 12 years believing I was protecting my daughter with a secret. I was not. I was protecting my self-image with a secret, and she paid for it. The mistake most people make isn't being too generous with their kids or too stingy with them. It's leaving them in the dark and calling it love. Information is armor. If you keep it in your pocket because you're worried about what your children will become, if they know, understand that you have not made them humble. You've made them easy. So here's the one thing you can actually do this week. And it doesn't matter whether you've got 81% of a company or $1,100 in a credit union. Write it down. What you have, where it is, what happens to it, who to call. Put it on paper, put it in an envelope, and hand it to the people who'll need it while you're alive and healthy and can answer questions about it. Not in a will they'll read while they're too destroyed to think straight. Now, at a kitchen table, with coffee. And here's the question I want you to sit with, because it's the one that still gets me at 4 in the morning. What are you keeping from someone you love, that you tell yourself is for their protection, and would you still be keeping it if it made you look worse instead of better? I'll tell you when I knew we were going to be all right. It was a Saturday in June. I was out front with the bucket and the wire brush doing the marble step, which takes about 20 minutes, and which I have done every Saturday for 47 years. And Nora came out of the house with a second brush. She didn't ask. She just sat down on the step below me and started on the bottom half, and we worked for a while without talking, and Mrs. Kowalczyk went past with her cart, and the neighborhood was doing what it does. And my daughter said, without looking up, "Mom used to do this part." I said, "She did. That's it. That's the whole scene. 2 people scrubbing a step. I've been in a ballroom with 300 people watching me end a man's career. I've signed things worth more money than most towns see in a decade. And I'm telling you honestly that the best moment of my entire life was a Saturday morning on a marble stoop on Fate Avenue with a wire brush in my hand and my kid on the step below me. All right, before I go, I'd like 3 things from you. First, tell me straight in the comments what you think of the choice I made, and I mean the real choice, not the ballroom. Comment 1 if you think keeping the money a secret was right, and I'm being too hard on myself, because plenty of people would have been ruined by knowing. Comment 2 if you think I should have told my daughter the truth the day she turned 21, and every single thing that happened after is on me. Or comment 3 if you think the secret was never really the problem that a man like Preston Vale would have found a way in regardless, and I'm just an old man looking for something to blame myself for so the story has a shape. I've got my own answer. I'm not going to put it in the description. I want to read yours first. Second, tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are right now. Somebody's always washing dishes at 1 in the morning in a city I'll never see, and honestly, that's the best part of doing this. And third, only if you feel like it. If you've ever been the one at the end of the table, the one they seated furthest away, the one they talked over, the one somebody quietly put a price on, say so. You don't owe anybody the details. Just say me too. Somebody's going to scroll past your comment tonight and feel a little less alone because you took 10 seconds. If this one stayed with you, hit subscribe. I'm one old man telling stories about people who got underestimated and about what it actually costs to be underestimated on purpose. Every single subscriber keeps this going, and I don't take it lightly. Take care of yourselves. Be careful who you make small for, and go scrub your step. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences. fully rewritten and reimagined in Baltimore, Maryland, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.